مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. طائرات مسيرة، أنظمة ليزر، صواريخ أسرع من الصوت، دخلت الأسلحة المستقبلية في سلب المنافسة بين الصين وأميركا، الأسلحة التي قد تقرر نتيجة حرب عالمية نتمنى جميعنا عدم وقوعها، ولكن ما الذي قد يتسبب بأزمة عالمية كبيرة؟ الجواب منطاد. حادثة المنطاد هي الفصل الأخير في حكاية التوتر المتزايد بين واشنطن وبكين. إنها حكاية تضمنت حروبا تجارية، اتهامات بشأن مصدر فيروس كورونا، انتقادات حيال تنمر الصين على هونغ كونغ، اتهامات بارتكاب إبادة جماعية داخل المنطقة الإسلامية في الصين، وخوف من التهديدات للصين المتنامية ضد البلدان الآسيوية الصديقة لأمريكا مثل الهند، فيتنام، كوريا، اليابان وأستراليا. قد يكون اقتصاد أمريكا والصين مرتبط بشكل وثيق، فالصين هي الآن شريك أمريكا التجاري الأكبر في سوق السلع، إلا أن التنافس حل الآن محل التعاون، وباتت المنافسة اليوم على شفير الصراع. ما هي استراتيجية الصين على المدى الطويل؟ كيف ترى الصين أمريكا من منظورها؟ هل الصراع حتمي؟ لمناقشة السياسة، الاقتصاد والمجتمع في الصين اليوم، يسرني أن أستقبل صديق قديم للبرنامج ديفيد ريني، رئيس مكتب تقرير مجلة The Economist في بكين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Yes, there is a war in mainland Europe, but the great strategic challenge of our time, both Republicans and Democrats agree, is China. Now, I'm delighted to welcome an old friend of Dakhel, Washington, The Economist's bureau chief in China, David Rennie. David, thanks so much for joining us directly from Beijing.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So first, let's just begin with something in the news. We're talking, you and I were talking in the wake of a mini crisis over a Chinese surveillance balloon shot down after loitering over the continental United States. What did Beijing say about this? What do most people in China know about it? And what do you think, what impact do you think this will have on the larger US-China relationship?
Those are all great questions. So to answer the first question, what is Beijing saying about it? Beijing is not saying a huge amount. The state media has only reported it a little bit, and that is kind of what you expect. When China has been caught doing something embarrassing, it tends to use its incredible control of state media and censorship to just limit the information. So it really has been very, very kind of limited coverage, just kind of reporting out some statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying that it's a weather balloon, saying that it was blown off course by accident, and that it was unreasonable and excessive of the Americans to shoot it down, and that now the balloon's sort of wreckage is being pulled out of the sea by the American Navy, that wreckage belongs to China. And so a sort of not too coded message from China, don't start embarrassing us by having some big display of, you know, whatever spy cameras the Americans might kind of pull out of the sea. So that's the official message. They then really interestingly use that same total control of the media scene, which includes total control of the kind of social media that people in China can access on their very tightly kind of controlled internet. And they've encouraged particularly kind of young people who spend a lot of time on the internet to think of this as almost a joke. And so they have played up the idea that this was, just a balloon, how ridiculous the Americans must be to fly a kind of hundreds of millions of dollars fighter jet and to shoot this balloon down with a missile that costs millions of dollars. What kind of cowards, what kind of overexcited, paranoid people the Americans must be to have done this ridiculous thing. And for a while, internet users were allowed to post kind of jokey cartoons, putting little messages on pictures of the balloon. Then they started taking those down because it was getting a little bit out of hand. But basically, in as much as ordinary Chinese think about it, they're following the state line that this is no big deal and how ridiculous it is for America to shut it down, and also how revealing it is that, in the words of some say, nationalist commentators who are approved by the Communist Party, their message is that this shows that the failings of American democracy all over again, because President Joe Biden had to do this ridiculous, exaggerated action of shooting their balloon down because he was under pressure from the opposition party, the Republicans, and this shows the kind of chaos and nonsensical decisions that you get in a democracy like America's. So that's the messaging, that's the propaganda. The final piece is that, from my perspective as a journalist for The Economist, trying to explain to my readers this week whether it is just a joke, whether it is just an exaggerated kind of piece of nonsense, I think I'm not convinced that it is just a funny joke. Why is it not a funny joke? Well, two big reasons. One, I think, is that we've had a glimpse of the kind of collision that many Americans in government, in the American military, have been very frightened about for some time, because America flies spy planes, sails American Navy ships in international seas and skies close to China to gather information about China, to fly the American flag, to show that America is, in its view, keeping security in the Pacific. And in the last few years, the Chinese military have been taking much bigger risks, flying Chinese fighter jets, sailing Chinese Navy warships really close to those American ships and planes. And again, American diplomats, American political leaders, American military officers have said to the Chinese, you are taking crazy risks. You are flying really close. Here's some video of one of your planes flying really dangerously close. One day, we're going to have two planes colliding in midair by accident, or two ships hitting each other in the sea. And the last time that happened, in 2001, when an American spy plane was rammed by a Chinese fighter, the Chinese pilot died, and it was a huge problem to get the American crew home because they had to do an emergency landing in China. And the big fear has been that if that sort of an accident happened again, given how much more confident China is than it was back in 2001, and given how much worse the relationship between America and China is over the last 20 years, there has been a real fear, which I have heard about from senior officials here in Beijing, that if that ever happened again, how on earth would we solve that? And so the reaction from senior Americans that I spoke to when they saw this balloon was, that's not funny. That is a glimpse of the kind of crisis that has been frightening us for a long time. And thank goodness this time, nobody died. Thank goodness it was a Chinese balloon and not a Chinese plane. But look at how badly the two sides have managed to sort of de-escalate. Look at the fact that the two sides don't agree on what this balloon was. Look at the Chinese demanding that the Americans, don't touch it, condemning the Americans for shooting it down. The American side, you see Republicans yelling at Joe Biden that he should have shot it down more quickly, calling him weak and embarrassing for not shooting the balloon down more quickly. So you see the pressures on both sides. And that is a warning that if we had a real full-on collision, how dangerous that would be. The final reason why this balloon isn't funny, Robert, is that because the Republicans were screaming at Joe Biden, because this was a balloon that lots of Americans could see from the ground in America, and it just felt like a hostile act by a country that somehow looks like an enemy, it made it impossible for America's top diplomat, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to land in Beijing for a long-planned trip where he was going to meet the Chinese Supreme Leader Xi Jinping. And that was a really important meeting because of COVID, because of the pandemic, you've not had that kind of high-level contact except for one meeting between President Biden and President Xi in Bali late last year. But the two sides have a lot of really serious problems to discuss, including problems that if they get out of control could cause a fight, like the problem of Taiwan. And the Americans have prepared very carefully to give Antony Blinken messages to deliver in person from Joe Biden to President Xi Jinping. And that meeting, both sides agreed, was really important. But because Joe Biden and the White House, they decided that it would look terrible for the top diplomat of America to be landing in Beijing while a Chinese spy balloon was still over America, they postponed his visit. And now with the angry words going back and forwards, it's hard to see that visit being put back on the diary agenda very soon. And so it's not funny. It may be a kind of balloon and everyone laughs at balloons, but actually it was a glimpse of something much worse and how badly the two sides have really been handling it. And it was also a real diplomatic setback because this important meeting could not happen.
Really fascinating. Thank you. Let's step back for a moment, David. You talked to all sorts of people in China, government officials, ordinary people. How do most Chinese, and I know that's a terrible exaggeration, but how would most Chinese characterize America? Competitor, adversary, enemy, something else? What is the frame?
All of those. I tell you what has changed. So Robert, I was a journalist in China 20 years ago for my first posting, and I've now been back in China for a second posting. I've been here 5 years now. And back 20 years ago, when things were bad, when we had problems between America and China, you could usually say, okay, so, people are angry about this or that disagreement. And the Chinese propaganda machine is saying all kinds of very aggressive things about America. But you could then say, but you know what? If you offered most young Chinese kids the chance to go to an American university or an American visa, they would take it in an instant and they would run to the airport and fly to America. The thing that has changed is two things. You asked about my contacts with officials and my contacts with ordinary people. So if you start with the ordinary people, now, the last time I talked to some Chinese students last week to actually talk to them about the war in Ukraine and China's friendship with Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader. And I said to these kids at the end, because we had a good conversation and they were being quite candid about how they admired Vladimir Putin and they thought that America is to blame for the war in Ukraine. And I said, okay, if I could give you the choice of a place at a university in America or a university in Russia, which would you take? And they were kind of a bit sneaky on the Russian one. They said, well, Russia's really cold. Maybe it's too cold for us to want to go. So I'm not sure that they really wanted to go to university in Russia because a lot of Chinese people think of Russia as kind of a bit poor and chaotic and a bit violent. But what they said about America was, I think, really sort of depressing and different from what you heard 20 years ago. What they said was, America is too chaotic. It's too violent. And why do they say that? They say that because China, which very strictly controls the news that people get, chooses the worst news for America every single day. They tell them about the latest gun massacre. They tell them about anti-Chinese racism. They tell them about hate crimes against Asians. And it is now much, much more common to meet ordinary Chinese who say, you know what, I think America is just a very dangerous place. I don't like the look of America. It seems to be really out of control. They didn't handle COVID well. And they're told only bad things about America. That's a big change. Now, it's not everybody, but there's definitely been a shift. And then if you talk to officials, if you talk to the people who run China, there's also been a shift. Now, Chinese officials were always complicated about America because they knew that America had technology and money and know-how that China needed to become more modern and more prosperous. But they were always kind of, America criticizes us. America says that we don't have democracy. America is a bully and invades other countries. There was always a complicated relationship, but there was respect and resentment of America. Now, the absolute consensus, at least when they're talking in public, is that America is not willing to let China rise to become a real competitor. That America has now shown that it is a vicious bully that is in decline, that hates being caught up with and even maybe overtaken one day by China. And because America is too racist and selfish to allow a country like China to rise to become an equal power, that America is now doing everything it can to try to contain China's rise, to deny China the chance to buy the most advanced technology, to sneakily use every argument it can against China. And that deep suspicion that America is actually bent on trying to contain China, I think that is very sincerely believed by a lot of people in the system. The one complication is that understanding that America still has technology and money and know-how that China needs, that's still true. And so that's why you see at the moment, because the Chinese economy is not in the best shape, because the American government has been quite successful about persuading other countries to join America in limiting exports of the most advanced technologies. Because America's been having some success, China has actually become a little bit more willing to lower the temperature. And the last few months, we have seen the Chinese supreme leader signaling that he would like to talk to America, that he thinks that tensions were maybe getting too high, and that he wants to lower the temperature. And so he's been on a bit of a charm offensive, not just with America, but other Western countries. And so it's a very complicated moment where, as a journalist in China, people ask me, is this charm offensive forever? Does Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, want to be America's friend now? I think it's more about right now and in the next few years, because there are still things America has that China wants and China needs. China's Communist Party leadership thinks, okay, maybe it's time to cool things a bit. Maybe the tensions got a bit too visible. But in the long term, thinking about 10, 20, 30 years, I think that distrust and that Chinese leaders' belief that America is actually really not willing to let China become an equal, that's really deep now in the system. And so I think we're headed into something very much colder and less friendly than the relationship that we saw even 20 years ago when I was first a journalist here.
All right, fascinating. When we come back after the break, we're going to take this long-term, cold approach that you're just described and ask, is conflict, even war, inevitable? Again, our guest today is David Rennie. David is Beijing bureau chief at The Economist. Previously, he was the European Union correspondent and the Charlemagne columnist based in Brussels, the British political editor and author of the Beige column based in London. And here in Washington, where I met him, he was the Lexington columnist and Washington bureau chief. David is fluent in Chinese, French, Spanish, and of course, his excellent native English. I have 1,000 questions to ask. We only have a little time. I'm going to ask just one final two-part question, because you're such an intimate observer of both China and the United States. What is something about China that most Americans don't know, but they should, and something about America that most Chinese don't know, and they should?
They've been told at the moment that American democracy is incredibly chaotic and incredibly messy. And, they're not wrong, right? I mean, I covered American politics for 9 years of my life. American politics is capable of making terrible mistakes. It's capable of electing bad leaders and good leaders. But the thing about American democracy is that it is the most efficient and powerful system that I know for correcting mistakes fast. I think that Americans need to know that the Chinese There's this story, how did China become so rich? And the Communist Party says, China became rich because the Communist Party is so good at running the economy. Actually, China became so much richer than it used to be because the Chinese people work unbelievably hard.
Terrific. This is really fascinating, David. I hope we can come back before too long and continue this conversation. It's really great to see you and to talk with you. David Rennie from Beijing, thank you so much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. Is war with China inevitable? Many think so, but I hope the doomsayers are wrong. And with a mix of strength, flexibility, and creativity, I believe we can manage our profound differences and avoid a conflict that could be as close to Armageddon as the world has ever come. There is no doubt that tensions between the United States and China are reaching a fevered pitch, and that's on a good day. Sometimes the battleground is technological. Sometimes it is economic, as we counsel friendly poor countries in Africa and Asia to avoid China's predatory loans. Sometimes it is humanitarian, as we dare to speak up, and often, about China's genocidal brutality toward its Uyghur Muslim population. And sometimes it is military, barely avoiding a clash between our demands for freedom of navigation in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea, and Beijing's demands to flex its muscles and expand its sphere of influence throughout Asia. And there's more than a hint that this could morph from us being adversaries into full-blown enemies, given the Chinese appetite to devour Taiwan and our commitment to the island's defense. Add it all up, and it looks vaguely like the 1930s, with China playing the contemporary role of an increasingly nationalistic and expansionist Germany en route to an almost inevitable clash with the status quo powers of the day. But if there is one thing about international relations I have learned over the years, it is that few things are inevitable. Just look at how the United States and the Soviet Union avoided catastrophe throughout the Cold War. To be sure, there were close calls, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the key word is close. Somehow, despite our deep mutual suspicion, our vast ideological differences, and our one-sided desire for victory, we managed not to stumble into the war to end all wars, or more precisely, the war to end all. It wasn't through pacifism, which only invites aggression, I'm afraid. It was through a mix of strength and restraint, each wisely and judiciously employed. Now, all eyes are currently on Ukraine, where, as Ukrainians fight to keep their lives and their country, the spine of America and its allies is being put to the test. No one is watching this more closely than the rulers in Beijing. For all the reasons we have to do everything we can to assist the Ukrainians and to impose defeat on a violent and expansionist Russia, add this one. Victory for Ukraine would do more to deter China than just about anything we could do to China directly. If we want to avoid a future war, we should do everything we can to help our friends win the current one. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن التوترات المتزايدة بين الصين وأمريكا، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاج إنسايد واشنطن أو راسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم، حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.